Welcome to the final lecture in the Henry VII series. In today's lecture, we will examine the role of the Catholic Church in society and examine to what extent it influenced culture and the arts. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will examine the structure of the Church and its role in society. Secondly, we will examine monasticism and the different types of monastic or religious orders that existed across England in the late medieval age. We will then examine a new philosophical movement called humanism, which is strongly associated with the Renaissance in Europe. We will examine how far the humanist movement was influencing scholarly thought and Henry's court. Finally, we will examine the arts, specifically art, music, and education of Henry's reign in order to assess how far it was influenced by the Church and how far it was influenced by the Renaissance. Let's first examine the role of the Church in early Tudor society. The role and control of the Catholic Church cannot be underestimated. The only day that ordinary people had off work was Sundays, when they were expected to attend Mass at their parish church. The only celebration days were saint days, when they were expected to attend church and give thanks to the saint. The church calendar was observed strictly by all communities, and the local parish church was at the center of the community. In addition, a person's life was marked into different stages by holy rituals called sacraments. Some of these are still widely observed today, such as baptism and marriage, but others are only observed by practicing Catholics, such as attending the confessional booth to observe penance. These stages were like a rite of passage, and during big occasions, such as when a child first receives the Eucharist during Sunday Mass, were celebrated by the whole community. This made the sacraments significant to everyday life. Everybody in the early Tudor age believed in the concept of eternal life after death, and believed that their behavior here on earth resulted in their final destination in either heaven and hell. They also believed in purgatory, which is where a soul enters in order to be purged of earthly sin before ascending to heaven. This helped to control their behavior, since they wanted to avoid sinful actions that could place them in purgatory for longer. It meant the ordinary people were more obedient to the Church and its teachings. For the rich, it also meant they paid huge sums of money to the Church as a form of penance, so to avoid spending a long time in purgatory. Let's now examine the structure of the Church. The Church mirrored secular, or non-religious, society in the sense that it had a strict hierarchy. There were approximately 35,000 ordained priests during the late 15th century. This means they have taken the sacrament of holy orders and were not allowed to take the sacrament of marriage. The Pope in Rome was the head of the Church, and he would appoint a single cardinal in England to act as his representative. The cardinals then formed what was called the College of Cardinals. When the Pope died, the college would meet to elect the next Pope. There has never been an English Pope since England was not a significant European nation. Most popes were chosen from Italian cardinals, though there was also the notorious Alexander VI from Spain, who was Pope in the second half of Henry's reign. Then there were 2 archbishops. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the more senior position, in charge of the Diocese of the South, and the Archbishop of York, who was in charge of the diocese in the north. They would meet with the bishops at convocation, which was like a church parliament, where important political decisions were made in relation to the governance of the Church. The bishops were each responsible for a diocese, which was a region of the country. Every diocese had a cathedral or minster, often in a developed town, like Lincoln or Winchester. The bishops oversaw the governance of every parish in the countryside in the surrounding area. Underneath the bishops were the parish priests. They would play the most important role within the local community as they would hold Sunday Mass to the ordinary people, known as the congregation. The priest would also be responsible for the sacramental life of each parishioner, by listening to confession, performing baptisms and weddings, and then finally the last rites. However, many parishes were impoverished, with the priest earning less than £15 a year, especially in remote and rural areas. The Catholic Church was central to European politics, and this filtered down to local regions. The bishops held a huge amount of influence in their diocese, and they also held a seat in the House of Lords, so could exert influence over secular, or non-religious, policies. Henry VII had a number of prelates, or leading bishops, on his royal council, such as Bishop Morton, who was his Archbishop of Canterbury and also a cardinal. Church courts would try church members for crimes as serious as murder, often with lighter punishments. This led to some conflict with the king, who could not control that part of his government. On a local level, the parish priest held judgment over any moral transgressions and, through the sacrament of penance, could essentially decide if a member of the congregation was forgiven of their sins and so could access the Eucharist and enter heaven. This has led traditional historians to argue that the Catholic Church held a lot of control at both the national and local level. There was instances of corruption in the Church. The most common grievance was pluralism, where an individual held more than one position. This was especially important for those, like Wolsey under Henry VIII, who held more than one bishopric. In parishes, a priest collected a stipend which was like a wage, and if they were in charge of more than one parish, this would double their income. However, in remote and rural parishes, this might have been more of a necessity than a greedy choice due to the impoverished nature of the parishes. Revisionist historians now see the late medieval church to be healthy on the eve of the Reformation. This is shown by how enthusiastically people accepted the return to the Catholic faith under Mary I. Let's now examine the role of monasteries in the early Tudor age. Monasticism is a way of living a life devoted to the worship of God. This often required living a life of isolation and self-discipline. There were approximately 10,000 monks and nuns in England during the late 15th century. They lived in monasteries, priories, friaries or convents, depending on which monastic order they had joined. Each took the sacrament of holy orders to devote their life to worship, and they all had to obey the Saint Benedictine laws of poverty, celibacy and obedience. By the late 15th century, there were many different monastic orders, and each one fulfilled their vows in different ways. Generally speaking, monks lived in seclusion, whilst friars worked within the community. There were closed monastic orders, like the Cistercian monks, who cut themselves off from the rest of the world and lived a self-contained life. Many employed locals, called lay brothers, to work as laborers so they could devote their lives to prayer. These communities were often in rural areas, and they often became very large and affluent. My dog's favourite monasteries of Rievaulx Abbey and Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire, they are out in the countryside and are both part of the Cistercian order. On the other hand, there were friaries, which were usually smaller communities. For example, the Augustinians. They would serve the community through education, almsgiving and healing. Friaries were often situated in towns. For example, both York and London had Augustinian friaries. There were fewer women who took holy orders than men. They lived in convents or nunneries, which were often smaller, and would have links to a larger monastery in the region. Some aristocratic women would be coerced into joining a convent if their family did not wish to provide them a dowry for marriage. Others would go there if they had been disgraced by their family. Like monks, they would fulfill a life of devotion to God and were expected to show lifelong obedience to the Church. Historians have bitterly disagreed about the extent of corruption in monasteries by the eve of the Reformation. Traditional historians argue that the monasteries became too powerful in their local communities and so used the money they received in donations in order to live an extravagant lifestyle. They point to the fact that many abbots would eat a rich diet of meat and keep mistresses. There was also corruption in the poorer, smaller monastic communities. For example, some nuns would become the mistress of a local priest or abbot and therefore bear illegitimate children. However, revisionist historians have argued that the monastic community was healthy and the vast majority of monks and nuns followed the Saint Benedictine vows. They argue that the monasteries provided an essential social service to the community since it was the local monastery that gave out alms to the poor, provided shelter for travelers, and provided an infirmary for the sick. In this sense, they provided an essential service that Henry's government did not provide to those most in need and so were respected by each local community. Let's now examine a new movement called humanism that was beginning to influence culture, especially in high society. This means that it influenced the culture of the rich, especially the nobility and members of the royal court, but had very limited impact on the lives of ordinary people. Humanism became synonymous with the Renaissance. It was based on the belief that humans had a huge wealth of potential and that through knowledge, education, and scientific inquiry, they can unlock this potential. The early Renaissance movement began in Italy during the mid-15th century. Leonardo da Vinci has become the figurehead, since he was not only an artist, but also an anatomist, engineer and architect, so pushed the limits of human knowledge and inquiry. The Renaissance began in Italy in the mid-15th century. It is synonymous with the awe-inspiring architecture of Italian cities like Florence, such as the dome on the Cathedral of Santa Maria pictured here. It is also synonymous with pioneering Renaissance artists, like Leonardo da Vinci. Whilst best known for his famous artworks like the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, da Vinci was also an engineer, philosopher and anatomist. He embodied the spirit of the Renaissance through his use of humanist thought. He pushed boundaries and used scientific inquiry in a thirst to pursue more knowledge. The movement then traveled to Northern Europe, where the Dutch scholar, Erasmus, became the most influential figure. He is famous as a writer. His most famous work, called Paraphrases, is a critical analysis of the New Testament that challenges many of the doctrines of the Catholic Church. In 1499, Erasmus arrived in England briefly, and then returned from 1504 to 1506 and based himself at Cambridge University. He made a series of famous lectures, including at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which helped to revitalize scholarly thought and education in England. Most importantly, Thomas More became a student of Erasmus during this time, and More would become the most important English humanist scholar of the Renaissance age during the reign of Henry VIII, with his book Utopia still read by philosophy students today. Traditional historians have often considered Henry VII to be the last of the late medieval kings since they compare his reign to the extravagant Renaissance of Henry VIII. However, the arrival of Erasmus in 1499 to the Tudor court heralds a new age at the turn of the century. Therefore, we can say that the English Renaissance starts in the final decade of Henry VII's reign. However, humanist thought was limited to academic circles, and the vast majority of ordinary people would not have been exposed to this new philosophy. In other words, the Renaissance only really impacted the richest members of society. Let's now examine the arts, in other words art, music, literature and architecture. Most historians would argue that there was very little change in the arts under Henry VII, and most of it had a religious focus and so was heavily influenced by the late medieval church. However, there are some examples of new ideas for the start of the Renaissance age. There was also improvements to education. For example, St. Paul's Cathedral School was opened and introduced new humanist methods of education. However, the improvements should not be exaggerated. It wasn't until after the dissolution of the monasteries that the Tudor monarchs opened a range of grammar schools and allowed access to children from a non-aristocratic background. Music did not change much during the late medieval age. Secular, or non-religious music, was usually in the form of folk songs and ballads that were passed down the generations. They would sometimes tell of legends and myths, such as the ballads of Robin Hood. Church music also remained very important since every cathedral would have choristers that sang at Mass. There was, however, a change in style to church music. It became more melodic rather than harmonic. This meant it moved away from the medieval style of chanting to a more modern style that had a tune or melody. Henry VII was not a huge patron of art, certainly not when compared to other Tudor monarchs. This is his most famous portrait. It was commissioned by Maximilian I in 1505 as part of a failed marriage negotiation which would have seen Henry marry Maximilian's daughter Margaret of Savoy. It was painted by a Dutch artist, and you can see Henry holding the Tudor rose, taking the opportunity to promote the Tudor dynasty through art. However, it does not provide an awe-inspiring image of Henry, certainly not compared to the portraits of his son Henry VIII and granddaughter Elizabeth. The printing press had arrived in England in 1476, under Edward IV, who first commissioned printed work in English. During Henry VII's reign, the majority of secular printed work was famous myths or stories, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or the Arthurian legends. This would certainly suggest that England had yet to enter the Renaissance. However, in 1504, Henry VII appointed a royal printer, and by this point more members of the gentry and nobility were learning how to read from printed texts. However, Henry VII showed no desire to use the printing press to advance humanist thought, never mind criticism of the Church. There was some evidence of Renaissance influence in the arts, but this should not be exaggerated. For example, the printing press was producing printed copies of the traditional stories of the medieval age. However, the artwork and music was still predominantly of the late medieval style, and religious devotion remained the main focus across all the arts. Furthermore, for the ordinary folk, who were largely illiterate, there was minimal impact of the Renaissance during Henry's reign. Let's return to the overarching question: to what extent did the Catholic Church influence early Tudor society, culture, and the arts? It is fair to say that the Church still had tremendous influence on the lives of ordinary people in early Tudor society, since the Church would mark out the passing of the year with Saint Day celebrations, and the rites of passage through life with the sacraments. They would also hold incredibly moral authority through the belief that our actions on earth influenced our life after death. Secondly, there was a vibrant monastic community in England which provided essential social services to those most in need, such as the giving of alms, shelter for travelers, and infirmary care for the sick. However, there was a new movement coming over from Europe that would challenge the monopoly of control that the Church had on the thoughts and ideas of the English people. This was called humanism, and it was founded on the belief that humans could use reasoning to discover things for themselves. The Renaissance did influence the arts in England, but only to a small extent. The majority of music, art, and education remained largely the same as it had under the Yorkist kings, and the printing press was still not widely used. Thank you for listening. Tune into my seminar in order to learn how to apply some of our learning on society, economics, and culture to an extract evaluation.